Hello and welcome back to the Mythic Archive. We left the ashes of Troy behind us. The Great War was over. The surviving heroes loaded their ships with gold and women, eager to see their wives and children after 10 years of slaughter. For most, the journey was short. But for one man, the journey would become a war in itself. His name was Odysseus. He was the mastermind of the wooden horse, the favorite of Athena, the man of twists and turns. He sailed from Troy with 12 ships and 600 men. He thought he would be home in Ithaca in a few weeks. He was wrong. It would take him 10 years. And of the 600 men who sailed with him, not a single one would survive except him. This is the story of the Odyssey. It began with a mistake. Fueled by the adrenaline of victory, Odysseus and his men did not sail straight home. They stopped at Ismarus, the city of the Cicones, allies of Troy. They sacked the city. They killed the men and enslaved the women. It was a pirate raid. Odysseus urged his men to leave quickly with their loot, but they were drunk on wine and victory. They stayed on the beach, feasting. While they partied, the Cicones gathered reinforcements from the mountains. They attacked at dawn. The Greeks were outnumbered. They fought bravely by their ships, but by sunset, 72 of Odysseus's men were dead. They fled into the sea, battered and grieving. It was the first lesson of the voyage: greed kills. A hurricane from the north blew them off course. They drifted for 9 days into unknown waters. They arrived at the land of the Lotus Eaters. This was not a violent threat, it was a psychological one. The natives offered the crew the lotus flower to eat. It was a narcotic, a drug of forgetfulness. The moment a man tasted the lotus, he lost all desire to go home. He lost his memory of his wife, his son, and his duty. He only wanted to stay and eat the flower forever. 3 of Odysseus's men ate it. They sat on the beach, smiling blankly, their past erased. Odysseus did not debate with them. He did not reason with addicts. He dragged them back to the ships by force, weeping and resisting. He tied them under the rowing benches and ordered the fleet to sail immediately. He realized that forgetting who you are is a fate worse than death. They sailed to the island of the Cyclops. These were giant, one-eyed shepherds, sons of Poseidon, who lived without laws. Odysseus, driven by fatal curiosity, wanted to see if they were civilized. He took 12 men and a wineskin of potent dark vintage and entered a massive cave. They waited. In the evening, the owner returned. It was Polyphemus. He was a mountain of flesh. He drove his flock of sheep inside and then rolled a massive boulder across the entrance. A stone so heavy that 22 wagons could not move it. The trap was shut. When Polyphemus saw the tiny men, he didn't ask for their passports. He grabbed 2 of them, smashed their brains out against the rocks, and ate them raw, bones and all. Odysseus watched in horror as his friends were devoured. He wanted to draw his sword and stab the giant in the liver, but he stopped. If he killed the giant, who would move the stone? They would die of starvation in the cave. Odysseus had to outthink a monster he could not outfight. The next day, the giant ate 2 more men for breakfast and left, blocking the door. Odysseus formulated a plan. He found a massive olive wood club in the cave. He sharpened it and hardened the point in the fire. When Polyphemus returned and ate 2 more men for dinner, Odysseus made his move. He offered the giant the potent wine he had brought. Polyphemus, who had never tasted wine, drank it greedily. He got drunk. "What is your name, little man?" the giant asked. "I will give you a gift. Odysseus replied with the most famous pun in history. "My name is Odysseus. My name is nobody." Polyphemus laughed. "Then my gift is this. I will eat nobody last." The giant passed out. Odysseus and his men heated the olive stake in the fire until it glowed. They lifted it high and drove it straight into the giant's single eye. Polyphemus woke up screaming. He pulled out the stake. He shouted for his neighbor Cyclops. "Help! Nobody is killing me!" The neighbors outside yelled back, "If nobody is hurting you, then it must be a sickness from Zeus. Be quiet." The trick worked, but they were still trapped. The Cyclops was blind, but he was not stupid. He sat in the doorway of the cave with his arms spread wide. He led his sheep out to graze, but he felt the back of every single animal to make sure the men were not riding them. But Odysseus was the master of tactics. He tied the rams together in groups of 3. Under the middle ram, he tied a man. He himself curled up under the belly of the largest ram, the leader of the flock. He held onto the thick wool with his hands and teeth. Polyphemus stopped the great ram. "Why are you last today, my favorite?" the giant asked sadly. "Are you grieving for your master's eye?" He did not know that his enemy was clinging to the animal's stomach, inches from his hand. He let the ram pass. They were free. They drove the flock to the ship and pushed off in silence. They had survived. But then Odysseus made the catastrophic mistake, the fatal flaw of the Greek hero, hubris, pride. He was safe at sea, but he could not bear the thought that the giant would live thinking he was defeated by nobody. He wanted credit. He stood on the deck and shouted, "Cyclops, if anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, the son of Laertes, the king of Ithaca." It was a foolish, arrogant boast. Polyphemus heard the name. He remembered a prophecy. He raised his hands to the sky and prayed to his father. "Hear me, Poseidon, blue-maned lord of the sea. If I am truly your son, grant that Odysseus may never reach his home. Or if he is destined to return, let him come late in bad case, with the loss of all his companions in a stranger's ship, and let him find trouble in his house." Poseidon heard the prayer. The sea, which was their road home, had just become their enemy. They sailed to the floating island of Aeolia, home of Aeolus, the keeper of the winds. Aeolus liked Odysseus. He hosted them for a month. When they left, he gave Odysseus a gift that should have solved everything. He put all the stormy winds, the north, south, and east winds, into a bag made of oxhide. He tied it with a silver cord. He left only the gentle west wind free to blow them straight home. It worked perfectly. For 9 days and nights they sailed. Odysseus stayed awake the entire time, steering the ship, desperate to see his home. Finally, on the 10th day, they saw the fires of Ithaca. They were so close they could see people tending the fires. Odysseus, exhausted and finally feeling safe, fell asleep. But while he slept, his men began to whisper. "What is in that bag?" they asked. "Odysseus always gets the gold and silver. It isn't fair." Driven by jealousy and suspicion, they opened the bag. The winds exploded. A hurricane burst forth. The ship was blown all the way back to Aeolia. When Odysseus woke up, he realized his sleep had cost him everything. Aeolus refused to help them a second time, declaring them cursed by the gods. Depressed and rowing without wind, they came to the land of the Laestrygonians. It was a land of eternal daylight. The harbor was calm, surrounded by steep cliffs on all sides. 11 of Odysseus's captains steered their ships into the safe harbor. But Odysseus, ever suspicious, moored his ship outside, tying it to a rock. It was the decision that saved his life. The Laestrygonians were not men. They were giants, a race of cannibals even worse than the Cyclops because they were organized. They stood on the cliffs and bombarded the ships in the harbor with massive boulders. They smashed the ships to pieces. Then they speared the drowning men like fish and carried them off to be eaten. It was a massacre. From his ship outside the harbor, Odysseus watched his fleet destroyed. He watched hundreds of his men die screaming. He drew his sword and cut the cable of his own ship. "Row!" he shouted. "Row or die!" They escaped, but they were no longer a fleet. They were one lonely ship carrying the last survivors sailing into a sea of monsters. With one ship left, they landed on the island of Aeaea. Odysseus sent a scouting party, led by his second-in-command, Eurylochus. They found a house built of polished stone in a clearing. But what terrified them was the garden. It was filled with mountain lions and wolves. But these beasts did not attack. They stood on their hind legs and fawned on the men like dogs begging for scraps. They were not animals, they were men trapped in animal bodies. Inside the house, they heard a woman singing. It was Circe, a goddess of magic, daughter of the sun. She invited them in. She gave them a potion mixed with cheese, barley, and honey. As they drank, she struck them with her wand. In an instant, their bodies warped. Their skin turned pink and bristly. Their noses became snouts, their voices turned into grunts. She turned the warriors of Troy into pigs and shut them in a sty. Only Eurylochus, who had suspected a trap, escaped to tell Odysseus. Odysseus grabbed his sword and marched to the palace. He would not leave his men. On the way, he met a young man. It was Hermes, the messenger god in disguise. Hermes warned him, "You cannot fight witchcraft with steel. If you enter that house, you will become a pig like the others." Hermes pulled a plant from the ground. It had a black root and a milk-white flower. The gods call it moly. It is dangerous for mortals to dig up, but Hermes gave it to him safely. "Eat this," the god said. "It will make you immune to her magic. When she strikes you with her wand, draw your sword and rush at her as if to kill her. She will back down. She will offer you her bed. Do not refuse, but make her swear the great oath of the immortals that she will not unman you." Odysseus ate the herb. He entered the palace. He drank the poison cup. Circe struck him and cried, "Down to the sty!" But Odysseus did not change. He drew his sword and lunged. Circe screamed and fell to her knees. She recognized him as the man of twists and turns foretold by prophecy. She swore the oath. She turned the pigs back into men, younger and taller than before. And then the Greeks did what they always did. They got comfortable. They stayed with the witch for a full year, feasting and forgetting their pain. After a year, the men begged Odysseus to go home. He asked Circe for leave. She agreed, but she gave him terrible news. "You cannot go home yet," she said. "You must first travel to the house of Hades. You must consult the ghost of the blind prophet Tiresias." To go to the underworld while still alive was a feat only Heracles and Orpheus had dared. They sailed to the river Oceanus, the edge of the world, where the Cimmerians live in eternal night. They beached the ship. Odysseus dug a pit. He poured libations of milk, honey, wine, and water. Then he cut the throats of a black ram and a black ewe. The dark blood flowed into the pit. Immediately, the souls of the dead swarmed up from Erebus. brides, old men, warriors still wearing their bloody armor. They wanted to drink the blood to regain their memories for a moment. Odysseus was terrified. He turned pale, but he drew his sword and sat by the pit. He had to hold back the dead, even his own mother, until Tiresias arrived. Tiresias came. He drank the blood and spoke the truth. He told Odysseus that Poseidon was angry. He warned him about the cattle of the sun. If you harm them, the prophet said, you will lose all your men and return home late and broken. He also gave Odysseus a strange task to perform after he got home, to carry an oar inland until he found a people who did not know the sea, and plant it there to make peace with Poseidon. Then Odysseus let the other ghosts drink. He saw his mother, Anticlea. He didn't know she was dead. She told him she had died of grief waiting for him. He tried to hug her 3 times, but she slipped through his arms like a shadow. Then came the heroes. Agamemnon came, weeping. He told Odysseus how his wife Clytemnestra had murdered him in his bath. Never trust a woman, the High King warned. Land your ship in secret. Then came Achilles. Odysseus tried to comfort him, saying he was a prince among the dead. But Achilles replied with the most famous lines in the epic. Do not speak to me soothingly of death, glorious Odysseus. I would rather be a slave on earth to a landless man than rule over all these dead. It was a stark rejection of the heroic code of the Iliad. Life, any life, is better than glory in the grave. Terrified by the clamor of the dead, Odysseus ran back to his ship. He had his sailing directions, but the road ahead led straight through the jaws of monsters. They returned to Circe briefly to bury a fallen comrade, Elpenor. Circe gave them food, and more importantly, a map of the terrors to come. They set sail. The first danger was the Sirens. These were creatures who sat in a meadow filled with rotting corpses, singing a song so beautiful that it promised absolute knowledge. They did not sing of sex, they sang of truth. Come here, famous Odysseus, they sang. We know everything that happened at Troy. We know everything that happens on the fruitful earth. It was a temptation of the mind. Odysseus wanted to hear it. He followed Circe's instructions. He plugged the ears of his crew with beeswax so they would be deaf, but he ordered them to tie him to the mast, hand and foot. If I beg you to release me, he commanded, tie me tighter. As the ship passed the island, the song washed over him. Odysseus screamed. He struggled against the ropes. He begged his men to untie him, promising them anything. But Eurylochus and Perimedes simply stood up and tightened the bonds. The deaf crew rowed past the temptation. Odysseus became the only man to hear the song of the Sirens and live to tell the tale. But escaping the Sirens only led them to the most impossible choice in naval history. They entered a narrow strait. On one side was Charybdis, a whirlpool that sucked the entire ocean down 3 times a day and vomited it back up. If the ship touched the whirlpool, everyone would die. On the other side was Scylla. She was a monster with 12 feet and 6 long necks, each ending in a head with 3 rows of teeth. She lived in a cave high up the cliff. Circe had warned Odysseus, better to lose 6 men than to lose them all. Odysseus made the hard command. He steered the ship toward the cliff, away from the whirlpool. He did not tell his men about Scylla, fearing they would panic and stop rowing. He put on his armor and stood on the prow, scanning the cliff. But Scylla was too fast. She struck like a nightmare. 6 heads shot down. She snatched up 6 of his best men. They dangled in the air. screaming Odysseus's name for the last time. He watched them being eaten at the mouth of the cave. He later said it was the most pitiable thing his eyes ever saw. But the ship passed through. He paid the toll of 6 lives to save the rest. Traumatized and grieving, they arrived at the island of Thrinacia. This was the pasture of Helios, the sun god. Here grazed his sacred, immortal cattle. Odysseus wanted to sail past it. He remembered the warnings of Tiresias and Circe, but Eurylochus, his second in command, led a mutiny of sorts. "You are made of iron, Odysseus," he complained, "but we are exhausted. Let us land and sleep." Odysseus agreed, but he made them swear a solemn oath never to touch the cows. They agreed, but the gods are cruel. A storm blew up. It trapped them on the island for a month. Their food ran out. They hunted birds and fish, but they were starving. One day, Odysseus went inland to pray to the gods for help. The gods answered by putting him to sleep. While he slept, Eurylochus spoke to the men. "All deaths are hateful," he said, "but death by hunger is the worst. Let us eat the cows and build a temple to Helios later to apologize." They slaughtered the best of the herd. When Odysseus woke up, he smelled the fat burning. He cried out in horror. But the horror was just beginning. The gods showed a sign. The hides of the dead cows began to crawl along the ground. The meat on the spits began to moo. It was a feast of damnation. Helios, the sun god, saw his cattle dead. He threatened Zeus. "If you do not punish them," he swore, "I will go down to the underworld and shine among the dead." Zeus could not allow the sun to disappear. He promised to strike. As soon as the Greeks launched their ship, a magical squall hit them. The rigging snapped, the mast fell and crushed the pilot's skull. And then Zeus threw a thunderbolt. The ship spun in circles and filled with sulphurous smoke. The men were thrown into the sea. Homer describes them bobbing like sea crows on the waves. There was no pity for them. They had eaten the gods' cattle. They drowned. Only Odysseus, who had not eaten the meat, survived. He lashed the keel and mast together to make a raft. He drifted back toward Charybdis. He barely survived by clinging to a fig tree while his raft was sucked down. He drifted for 9 days. Finally, he washed ashore on the island of Ogygia. He was alive, but he was alone. He had lost his army, his fleet, and his friends. And now he would be a prisoner of love for 7 years. For 7 years, Odysseus lived on the island of Ogygia. It was a paradise. The air smelled of cedar and thyme. The goddess Calypso, a daughter of the Titans, loved him. She took him into her bed. She offered him what Gilgamesh had searched for and failed to find: immortality. She promised that if he stayed, he would never age and never die. But Odysseus refused. Every day he sat on the rocky shore, staring across the wasteland of the sea, weeping for his wife Penelope and his rocky island of Ithaca. He chose a mortal life of struggle over an eternal life of ease. Finally, Athena begged Zeus to intervene. Zeus sent Hermes to order Calypso to let him go. The goddess was furious. She accused the male gods of jealousy, but she obeyed. She gave Odysseus an axe to build a raft. She gave him bread and wine, and she sent him a warm breeze. He sailed away alone, leaving immortality behind. But Poseidon was not done. He saw Odysseus on the raft and sent one final storm. He smashed the raft to pieces. Odysseus swam for 2 days and 2 nights, kept afloat by a magical veil given to him by a sea nymph. He washed up on the island of Scheria, the land of the Phaeacians. He crawled into the bushes and slept under a pile of leaves like a wild animal. The next morning, the Princess Nausicaa came to the river to wash clothes. When Odysseus emerged, naked and crusted with salt, looking like a monster, all the maids ran away screaming. Only Nausicaa stood firm, inspired by Athena. Odysseus used his silver tongue. He did not beg, he complimented her. He asked if she was a goddess or a mortal. Nausicaa gave him clothes and led him to the palace of her father, King Alcinous. The Phaeacians were master sailors who lived close to the gods. They hosted him. And it was here, in their court, that Odysseus finally revealed his name and told the story of his adventures, the story we have just heard. Moved by his suffering, King Alcinous promised to send him home. The Phaeacians had ships that steered themselves and read the thoughts of their pilots. They were faster than a falcon. They carried the sleeping Odysseus across the sea in a single night. They laid him gently on the sand of Ithaca, piling treasures of bronze and gold beside him, more wealth than he would have ever brought back from Troy. But Poseidon was furious that his escort had helped his enemy. As the Phaeacian ship returned to its harbor, Poseidon struck it with his hand. He turned the ship and its crew to stone, rooting it to the ocean floor forever. It was a cruel reminder that kindness to a hero often carries a terrible price. Odysseus woke up. He did not recognize his own country. Athena had covered the land in a mist to protect him. He thought the Phaeacians had tricked him, but then the mist lifted. Athena appeared. She pointed to the olive tree and the cave of the nymphs. Odysseus kissed the earth. He was home. But he could not just walk into his palace. Athena warned him that his house was full of enemies. 108 Suitors, young, arrogant noblemen from the surrounding islands, were living in his hall. They were eating his food, sleeping with his maids, and pressuring Queen Penelope to marry one of them. They planned to kill Odysseus' son, Telemachus. If Odysseus revealed himself, they would slaughter him. So Athena used her magic. She withered his smooth skin. She destroyed his blonde hair. She dimmed the fire in his eyes. She turned the king of Ithaca into a filthy, old beggar. He went to the hut of his swineherd, Eumaeus. Eumaeus did not recognize his master, but he followed the laws of hospitality. He gave the beggar food and a warm cloak. There, Odysseus reunited with his son Telemachus, who had returned from a journey searching for news of his father. Odysseus revealed himself to his son. They wept together. And then, they began to plan their revenge. 2 men against 108. Odysseus walked to his palace. Outside the gates, lying on a pile of dung, was a dog. It was Argos. 20 years ago, Odysseus had bred him as a puppy for hunting, but he sailed for Troy before they could hunt together. Now the dog was old, infested with fleas, and neglected by the servants. But when Argos heard the voice of the beggar, he knew. He thumped his tail. He flattened his ears. He tried to stand up to greet his master, but he was too weak. Odysseus turned his face away to hide a tear from Eumaeus. "It is a shame," he said, "that such a fine dog lies in the muck." He entered the palace, and in that moment, having seen his master one last time, the Black Death descended on Argos. He died happy. It is the most touching moment in the epic, showing that loyalty transcends time. Odysseus entered the hall. The suitors mocked him. They threw a stool at him. They forced him to fight another beggar for their amusement. He endured it all. He watched his wife, Penelope, descend the stairs. She announced a contest. She brought out the great bow of Odysseus, a weapon so stiff that only the king could string it. Whoever can string this bow and shoot an arrow through the holes of 12 axe heads, she declared, I will marry him. The suitors tried. One by one, they failed. They warmed the bow with grease, but they were too weak. Then the beggar asked for a turn. The suitors shouted in anger, fearing he might succeed. But Telemachus ordered them to give him the bow. Odysseus took the weapon. He checked it. Then, as easily as a musician strings a lyre, he bent the great bow and slipped the string into the notch. He plucked the string. It sang like a swallow. Thunder rumbled overhead. Zeus was signaling the end. Odysseus grabbed an arrow. Without even standing up from his stool, he fired. The arrow flew straight through all 12 axe heads. The contest was over. The slaughter was about to begin. Odysseus turned to Antinous, the leader of the Suitors, who was lifting a golden cup of wine to his lips. The game is finished, Odysseus said. He fired. The arrow struck Antinous in the throat. The point punched through the back of his neck. He dropped the cup. He kicked the table, scattering the bread and meat. The other suitors sprang up, looking for weapons, but there were none. Telemachus had hidden them. You dogs, Odysseus roared. You thought I would never come home from Troy. You fleeced my house, you raped my maids, and you courted my wife while I was still alive. Now the cords of death are around you all. Panic erupted. Eurymachus tried to negotiate, offering to pay back all the gold. Odysseus refused. Not even if you gave me your father's entire fortunes would I stop my hands from killing. The battle was brutal. It was 4 men, Odysseus, Telemachus, the swineherd and the cowherd, against 100. But they had the high ground, and they had Athena. The goddess deflected the suitors' spears. Odysseus and his son moved like reapers in a field. They killed them all. The floor smoked with blood. The maids who had betrayed the queen were rounded up and hanged in the courtyard like thrushes on a line. The house of Odysseus was purged. The battle was over, but the hardest test remained. Penelope. She came down to the hall. She saw Odysseus, bathed and dressed in royal robes by Athena. But she sat silent. She did not run to him. She had guarded her heart for 20 years. She could not open it in a second. Telemachus scolded her, but Odysseus smiled. Let her test me, he said. Penelope ordered the nurse to move the royal bed out of the chamber for him to sleep on. This was the trap. Odysseus snapped. Woman, who has moved my bed? He demanded. It is impossible. I built that bed myself. I built the bedroom around a massive olive tree. The trunk of the tree is the bedpost. It is rooted in the earth. Unless a god moved it, it cannot be moved. Penelope burst into tears. She ran to him and threw her arms around his neck. This was the secret sign. Only they knew about the bed. It was the symbol of their marriage, rooted, immovable, and alive. They wept, holding each other. Homer says that their joy was like the joy of a shipwrecked sailor who finally touches dry land. The long journey was over. The king had returned.